versa sobre determinantes y contexto de la alimentación complementaria. A primera vista es un tema sencillo, pero en realidad es un tema de gran complejidad. Cuando uno trabaja en un laboratorio y quiere una pregunta específica, diseña algo para controlar todos los determinantes y aislar solo uno. Y entonces uno, en este modelo, puede manipular en corto tiempo una serie de variables para obtener solo el juego de aquella que a mí me interesa. Sin embargo, en la vida real, prácticamente es imposible establecer este tipo de modelos. Y en los determinantes de la alimentación complementaria que reciben los niños en todos los países, los factores sociales, económicos, educativos, solo por mencionar algunos, todos los cuales metidos en un gran modelo constituyen en cada una de las regiones ese credo en el que se cree como comunidad, corresponde a los factores culturales. Y hablando del factor cultural, y solamente dedicándome un poquitito a la alimentación, Mesoamérica junto con Perú son, en Latinoamérica junto con otros lugares en otras partes del mundo, pero no son muchos, los sitios en donde se generó la agricultura en forma autónoma. Y México tiene una gran cantidad de alimentos que aquí se generaron, que se producen, que se consumen con una particularidad tan propia que la UNESCO ha otorgado a muchos de los alimentos que consumimos en México el valor de patrimonio de la humanidad. Este es un asunto verdaderamente serio, porque junto con todo esto no tardó en que tuvimos 3 siglos de conquista y luego 2 siglos después tenemos una globalización, una industrialización de alimentos que ha cambiado el estilo de vida de los mexicanos en muy corto tiempo. Los que vivimos en este momento vemos a nuestros abuelos como algo totalmente distinto. Bien, ¿cómo enfrentar en este contexto tan complejo que nos toca vivir estos problemas? Ha sido el encargo que la Bienal ha pedido a nuestros 3 próximos ponentes. Voy a empezar por presentar a la doctora Linda Dyer, quien inició sus estudios en el área de la biología, continuó con un posgrado en antropología biológica en la Universidad de Pensilvania y realizó un postdoctorado en biología y demografía en el Centro de Población de Carolina en la Universidad de Carolina del Norte en Chapel Hill. Actualmente es profesora de nutrición en la Escuela Gillings de Salud Pública Mundial de la Universidad de Carolina del Norte en Chapel Hill, donde dirige la División de Epidemiología Nutricional, siendo actualmente miembro del Centro de Población de Carolina. Sus intereses de investigación se centran en el crecimiento infantil, desarrollo de enfermedades crónicas, nutrición y salud reproductiva de la mujer. En la Universidad de Carolina del Norte imparte cursos de nutrición internacional y métodos analíticos en epidemiología nutricional. Fue galardonada en 2014 con el premio Kellogg's en Nutrición Internacional y cuenta con varios reconocimientos por su actividad en la docencia. Tiene más de 280 publicaciones en revistas biomédicas internacionales y participa en diversas sociedades académicas y grupos científicos. Le doy la bienvenida a la doctora Linda Dyer y le cedo el micrófono. Doctora Dyer, por favor.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to add my thanks to the organizers, not only for bringing us here to learn so many wonderful new things, but also for the wonderful hospitality that's been extended to us as the visitors. So thank you very much. My talk today is more conceptual than kind of basic science evidence, and it's really designed for us to think about some of the pathways through which these underlying social and economic factors may influence complementary feeding and thereby affect the way that we think about developing interventions. And then Dr. Frangillo, for example, will be following on and talking about interventions. So I hope this will kind of set the stage for that talk to come. Sorry, I'm getting no response here. Sorry? Oh, the mouse, I'm sorry, I was using this. Okay. So complementary feeding really represents a world of different types of issues. I put this slide on the picture on the left here with inspiration from my colleague, Dr. Amanda Thompson, who did her research on looking at feeding practices in infants in Atlanta, Georgia. And one of the first foods they got was avocados. And this was a very different pattern than you would typically see in the US. On the lower right-hand side of the slide, you see a very thin porridge. And this type of gruel is much more often given to children in low-income countries around the world as a first food. In the top right panel, you see a woman from Nigeria feeding this type of gruel to her infant, and it's actually in a kind of forced feeding situation. And this is a picture that was given to me by Dr. Peggy Bentley, talking about this feeding style where the parent is really in the driver's seat and trying to make sure that this child gets this liquid into their bodies. And then in contrast, on the bottom left, we have the baby-led weaning, which I'll mention more later. So we need to think about these issues in a very complex world. I put this slide up here. This is based on work on growth that I've been doing in a population in Kigali in Rwanda. And what you're looking at is Z-scores of children over the first 2 years of life. And I'm using this slide to illustrate, well, first of all, Rwanda was one of the countries that was the poorest in Africa not so long ago. It is a country where there's a very high prevalence of HIV. And yet, despite that, the pattern of child growth that we're seeing in the past, this is a brand new study, we just finished collection of the data a few months ago, is this decline in length for age Z-scores. So what you see here is the length for age in boys and girls. This is the weight for age Z-score. And because of the greater decline in linear growth than in weight, we see that the weight for height Z-scores of these children are all hovering above 0.5. And so even in this low-income country context, we're seeing relatively chubby babies. And so we need to understand more about this. So there's still something about their complementary feeding that's associated with linear growth retardation at the same time that their weight is not so strongly influenced, resulting in the beginnings of child obesity, even in this type of population. So the mothers look at these babies, and you can imagine that they see very round, healthy-looking babies without really appreciating that there's still a significant level of stunting. So in this group of children, we see that about 23% of girls, but more than 40% of the boys are stunted by the time they're 24 months old, but yet their weight for length and BMI Z-scores are about 0.5. So I think this is the context in which we need to think about complementary feeding. The other context comes from work that I've done with many colleagues at the University of North Carolina on children in China. And here I would draw your attention to the blue bars, which represent children between the ages of 7 to 10 years in the China Health and Nutrition Survey, and we can already see that at this age, we have children with high triglycerides, high LDL cholesterol, low HDL cholesterol, high triglycerides. We see this in both males and females, and the prevalence goes even higher when we get to the 11 to 18-year-old group. But I think for us here, it's really important to think about this younger age group. And then if we also look at the early development of hypertension, high levels of hemoglobin A1C, and inflammation, we can see that this younger age group at 7 to 10 is already at risk. So this is what we really need to be thinking about in the context of complementary feeding. We need to be thinking about it in the context of the dual burden. And I'm sure you're very familiar with this concept, the idea that over and undernutrition can coexist in individuals, in households, within families, and within populations. And so on the one hand, we have to worry about excess energy and protein intakes, for example, as risk factors for child overweight and obesity, with excessive feeding, as we've heard, high protein intakes, also poor diet quality, excess sugar, fat, salt, sugar-sweetened beverages, salty and sugary snacks. But at the same time, in those contexts, we can have low micronutrient density and the co-occurrence of obesity with problems like anemia. So that's one aspect of the dual burden. We still find, even in middle-income countries, a continuing prevalence of stunting, and in lower-income countries, continued underweight and fairly severe micronutrient deficiencies that are associated with inadequate feeding, with insufficient frequency and quality, low diet diversity, and poor nutritional adequacy associated with low intake of animal foods. So when we think about complementary feeding in the context of a country like Mexico, we really need to keep in mind that the dual burden is still a problem and that the solutions that we may need to optimize complementary feeding have to address those remaining double burden issues. So I think we can best understand the determinants of complementary feeding by what Dr. Huerta has already mentioned in his introduction today, that these decisions are very complex. They're influenced by a very wide array of factors. And a lot of the studies in this area have been guided by some conceptual models that identify multiple levels of influence. And most of these conceptual models consider that feeding decisions are influenced at the individual, household, community, and societal levels. So one of the very commonly used models that we see to try to understand factors like complementary feeding, child obesity, et cetera, is the socio-ecological model. And here we conceptualize complementary feeding as being influenced at the individual level by things like the mother's income, education, her autonomy, her beliefs and preferences, and her own health status and the health status of the child. At the interpersonal level, the influences are family, the spouse, the grandmother of the child, the friends of the mother who can be influencing her decisions. At the next level, the organizational level, we have NGOs, we have complementary feeding programs, we have healthcare workers that are influencing the mother in her decisions. At the level of the community, we have community norms, things like the place of residence, urban, rural residence, the availability and cost of complementary foods. And then at the outermost level of the socio-ecological model, we have public policy. And we've been talking about international guidelines, for example, WHO complementary feeding guidelines. There are also things like regulations on commercially prepared complementary foods from organizations such as WHO. And also food assistance and welfare programs in the US, dominated by WIC, or the Women, Infants, and Children Assistance Program, that has a very strong influence on the complementary foods that are chosen by mothers to feed. And then we also have things like workplace regulations around maternity leave and breastfeeding that can influence the timing and the mother's decisions about introducing complementary foods. A similar model is the health determinants model, and I won't go through all of the stages here, but the idea is that women are influenced at multiple levels simultaneously, and they face not only information, but constraints that they have to face when making their decisions about feeding. So I'd like to walk through a number of hypothesized pathways of influence and evaluate just a small amount of the evidence with caveats that most of what we know is based on complementary feeding with respect to obesity at any rate. The literature is very descriptive. So there are a number of studies based on large surveys that say, these people do this and these people do this, but very little true causal evidence on these associations that we'll be looking at. And so most of the literature on complementary feeding in low and middle income country context really focuses on underweight and stunting. And the studies in high income countries are focused on obesity risk, and these would be studies in the US, Australia, the UK, and that's where we get the predominant literature on obesity. And then relatively little information on middle income countries now facing that important nutrition transition. So first I was asked to talk about urbanization, poverty, and family today. And so let's start with urbanization. And urbanization can influence mothers' decisions about feeding and what she actually feeds in a number of different ways. One of them is through time use and work patterns. Another, availability, cost of complementary foods. Urbanization might influence her education, her social networks, her access to healthcare, and her exposure to media. So in a little bit more detail on some of these. We know that in urban environments, access to markets is greatly enhanced. And so this will likely have a strong effect on the availability and the accessibility and cost of different types of complementary foods. And this may be, on the one hand, pre-prepared and packaged foods, such as instant weaning foods. We've all seen a lot of advertising for the many products that are aimed at improving the micronutrient composition of children's diets. But at the same time, this may be associated with a high cost of animal source foods that may be less available in certain urban environments. So through this pathway, urbanization may favor the early introduction and or low quality of complementary foods, unless those urban markets also have lower cost and high quality foods available. Another very important pathway is the one that operates through women's work and time use. And so on the one hand, if women are highly time constrained, owing to the need to work outside of their home environments, work for pay, they may not be able to bring babies with them to the workplace. And they may be more likely to rely on prepackaged foods that are convenient, instant foods, because of those time constraints. In addition, many working mothers have a need for alternate caregivers, and it's very difficult then for the mother to be in charge of the complementary foods when she's not the primary caregiver. And so this may favor early introduction and also low quality of complementary foods. Urbanization may also influence nutrition knowledge through education and social networks, and urban and rural women may have very different composition of their social networks. They also have different access to healthcare, and so there's a potential for those healthcare workers to have a positive influence by promoting the adherence to the feeding guidelines, which we hope are indeed evidence-based. Another factor is exposure to media. And in general, urban women are more likely to be exposed to a wider variety and a greater barrage from media, all types of media, which may be advertising processed foods, but they may also be carrying with them good information about complementary feeding. So what kind of evidence do we have to support the links that I've shown you in these pathways? Well, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of cross-sectional studies that compare practices. For example, there are a number of demographic and health surveys from all over the world, and in a recent series, they have taken the indicators that are recommended for evaluating complementary foods, including, just to remind you, the timely introduction of complementary foods, adequate dietary diversity, and adequate meal frequency. They've taken those indicators and looked at them in relation to place of residence, maternal education, etc. So what we get from a number of individual studies using DHS or national data, as well as several reviews that have put together the DHS surveys from multiple settings, is that in low and middle income countries, rural mothers are much more likely to delay the introduction of complementary foods to between the time period between 6 and 8 months. They're more likely to feed a diet that's low in diversity and also low in micronutrient content, and to feed with inadequate frequency. This is based on a study that was done looking across 5 South Asian countries, just to give you an example of the kinds of information we have available to us. This was a study comparing Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. And across the top, you'll see the column headings indicating the different indicators: introduction of solids, minimum diet diversity, minimum meal frequency, minimum acceptable diet, which is a combination of those 2 previous indicators. And you'll see that based on the prevalence of these indicators, India has only slightly over half of mothers introducing foods in a timely way. A very low percent have minimum diet diversity. Only 41% meet the minimum meal frequency, and only 9% meet the minimum acceptable diet. So clearly this is a major problem, and something which is very important for the declines in length Z-scores and for the dramatically increased prevalence of stunting that we see in settings like India and other South Asian countries. So urbanization is also related to numerous other risk factors, and some of these include things like literacy, work, and media exposure, which I mentioned earlier. And the DHS data and national surveys show us that in general, low literacy and lack of formal education are associated with delayed introduction of complementary foods, as are lack of prenatal and well child care in the postnatal period. Maternal work outside the home is associated with earlier weaning and use of alternate caregivers. In some settings, there are associations of maternal work with lower diet diversity, while in others, maternal work is actually associated with higher diet diversity. We also have conflicting evidence on things like exposure to media, where in some places, more media exposure is associated with better, more optimal feeding practices, and yet in other places, exposure to media has detrimental consequences on child diet quality. But I think the main thing that emerges from all of these studies is that information on causal relationships is really lacking. These pathways are hypothesized, and based on factors that we know differ between urban and rural environments, but we can't actually pinpoint the exact factors that are influencing the outcomes. So moving on to poverty, these relationships are very similar in many ways to that of urbanization. And we know that poverty is associated in many settings with low women's autonomy and empowerment, inability to purchase nutritious complementary foods, low education levels, inadequate means for preparation of appropriate complementary foods. But then on the other hand, poverty may be associated with access to food assistance programs that may improve complementary feeding, and certainly that's the goal of many of the assistance programs that operate in many settings. I'd like to call out in particular the role of women's autonomy, and there was an excellent review written in 2015 showing that higher maternal autonomy unfortunately is associated with shorter breastfeeding duration, but at the same time an increased likelihood of appropriate timing of complementary feeding adequate feeding frequency of children, better quality foods, and more animal source foods in the diet of children. And this is based on a view of a number of different settings around the world. When we look at the role of women's empowerment, we know that empowerment can influence the allocation of household resources, resulting in greater expenditure on food. So many studies show that where women have more control over decision-making within the household, they're more likely to spend more money on child welfare, and in particular better quality feeding and taking the children for well-child visits. So empowerment has a positive effect on the timing of complementary foods, the number of meals, and the quality of foods that are fed to children. Moving to family structure, there is a fair amount of literature available looking at grandmothers as alternative caregivers and as important sources of advice for the woman who's faced with decisions about how to feed her child. Families can be involved directly in the provision of food, and then in addition, family structure may influence whether or not there are younger children in the household. If there are, this might influence time and resources available for the mother to spend on the new infant. The older children can also serve as role models for eating. And maternal experience certainly plays a very important role, and we see different feeding practices for first-time mothers versus higher order births, partly because mothers have gained important experience in feeding. So the literature really shows us that grandmothers have a special role. And the literature here is based on a number of qualitative studies, and we'll hear more about qualitative research and its importance from Dr. Pelto shortly. But one of the things that mothers often mention is the fact that they can't remain in the driver's seat in the presence of the grandmother. So the grandmother is telling them what to do, and often suggesting feeding practices that are inconsistent with the advice that they're getting from the healthcare workers and from, more reliable in some cases, information on complementary foods and feeding nutritious foods. So for example, there was a study of Latino mothers in the US, and this reported that family members, and in particular grandmothers, like to indulge the child with foods that they like, the things that they think the child likes, and so typically these were higher sugar items. A study from Malawi indicated that grandmothers made the decision about complementary foods in about 20% of the cases where complementary foods were given before 6 months. So there's often pressure from the grandmother to the mother to feed complementary foods earlier, even if, as she reports, the mother disapproves. But depending on the power structure within a household, we may have the role of the grandmother being very important, particularly if women's autonomy is low and she's not able to stand up and say, no, I've learned that it's better to wait to introduce complementary foods. Some work in Indonesia found that on 90% of study days, child had a non-maternal caregiver. And in 30% of those days, the role of that maternal caregiver was for infant feeding. And then another study from the UK showed that there was a high level, in fact, the most important influence came from the previous generation, grandmothers and their families, maternal aunts. They were more influential than health visitors in affecting early complementary feeding. But even in that setting, if the woman had a better understanding of the feeding guidelines of the UK, she was more able to more optimally feed her child. So there are a number of studies that look at other family members. There's DHS data from a number of places around the world showing that higher birth order, as I mentioned before, is associated with increased likelihood of meeting minimal dietary diversity and meal feeding guidelines. But at the same time, with other children, there may be pressure for earlier introduction of solid foods when there's multiple children in the household to take care of. There are a number of studies that have looked at fathers. They tend to be important role models for children, but unfortunately, while fathers' intakes are associated with children's intakes, the concordance tends to be higher for things like sweet snacks and chips, but not vegetables. So if dad liked vegetables, it didn't necessarily mean that he would feed those to the child, but if dad liked sweets, then he was more likely to feed those to the child. There's also evidence on the role of the maternal diet. We heard a little bit about that from Susan Johnson yesterday. A UK study in the Southampton Women's Study collected food frequency data on mothers and on their infants at 6 and 12 months. And they identified several different dietary patterns. One of them was adherence to infant feeding guidelines, which was associated with high fruit, vegetable, and home-prepared foods. And this was more typical of older, more educated mothers and those who were either first or second-time mothers, and a better maternal diet for the child. The less healthy pattern was associated with more bread and savory snacks, biscuits and chips. And there was an association of this pattern in the mother with pattern in the child. And this makes sense because of the maternal food purchases and the availability of food in the household will influence what is chosen for the child. There are other studies around the world. This is one actually where Dr. Frangillo is a co-author. Comparative study on 3 countries using 24-hour recalls, and there was high agreement between mother and child diets that should be staples, not stables, and disagreement on flesh foods where the mom ate more meats than the child less, dairy foods where the child had more than the mother, and fruits and vegetables where the mother also ate more fruits and vegetables than she gave for the child. So the odds of meeting the minimum dietary diversity recommendation was associated with the mom having a more diverse diet. A higher diet diversity in the moms was predicted by higher education. So this has important implications also when we think about interventions to influence the mother's diet as well as directly focusing on the child. So there have been a number of questions about baby-led weaning, and I know that when I was listening to them, I know that I had a couple of slides on this topic, so I'll just go through those, even though you've heard some of these points before. And I bring this up not as an advocate of baby-led weaning, but just as an example of a cultural phenomenon, which is incorporating a number of different ideas that we have about infant capabilities, about who should be, as my colleague at UNC says, who should be driving the bus in terms of making decisions. And so this baby-led weaning movement really focuses more on how to feed than what to feed. The current guidelines that we have for feeding really advocate graduated exposure to solid foods with different texture, from pureed to mashed to chopped foods to finger foods. Pureed foods are really needed for younger infants before they get teeth. And so some think that these guidelines are sort of a holdover from the time when earlier feeding was recommended and it was necessary to spoon feed those purees. So baby-led weaning advocates recommend skipping that early stage and going directly to finger foods and using family foods instead. And so there are a number of advantages and disadvantages. The claim is that baby-led weaning will lead to better self-regulation of intake on the part of the child, lower obesity, better diet quality, enhanced motor development, and favorable effects on parental feeding. And there's a study that shows less maternal anxiety and less pressuring and restricting food styles. The concerns that have been raised about baby-led weaning are for choking, and as Dr. Koletsko mentioned in the discussion earlier, lower quality foods, in particular lack of animal source foods, because there are concerns about feeding meats and chunks of meat to babies because of choking. So concerns also relate to growth faltering, and if you're feeding the child the family diet, if the family diet's not good, then the child's diet's not going to be good. So if the quality is unsuitable, then the baby-led weaning approach may involve, feeding cookies to the child instead of broccoli. So what kind of evidence do we have? There's very limited evidence, as was mentioned. There's a couple of cross-sectional studies that prohibit any kind of causal inference. One of the studies showed that there was no association between parent-reported weight of the child at 6 months with baby-led weaning, but in older toddlers, they had lower mean body weight, and the parents reported that they were less fussy and more satiety responsive. Another study shows lower incidence of obesity in children who had experienced baby-led weaning. And then baby-led weaning was associated with more meals with the family, higher fat content, but lower iron, zinc, and vitamin B12 in 6 to 8 month olds. These studies are very problematic, and one of the key issues is selection. So a mother who chooses to feed her child in this way is more likely to be highly educated. She may have a different feeding style to begin with, and so baby-led weaning and the consequences of it may be influenced by common underlying characteristics of the mother and not really attributed to the weaning at all. So I think we need to interpret these studies with a high level of caution, but what I think they represent is an attempt to put the baby in the driver's seat and to respect the baby's physiology in a way, and to be responsive to feeding so that we're not overriding those feeding cues with excess sugar, salt, etc. So now just to end with some of the implications, mothers are juggling values, beliefs, ideas about food, infant preferences, alongside family circumstances, the cost of high quality foods, the low cost of some commercially available instant foods, the convenience of complementary foods. They're also juggling their time for child care, for work and leisure. So these decisions are very complex. So if we want to appropriately target interventions, we need to know who's the main decision maker, who else influences the decision, and this is going to influence to whom we target our interventions. And I think one of the lessons from the literature on families is the importance of involving other caregivers in interventions. And I'll just note that several of my colleagues, and Amanda Thompson's also involved in this project at the University of North Carolina, are doing an intervention study called Mothers and Others. And the mother of the young child delegates an individual who's another caregiver to receive the intervention as well. So this is very important in terms of family structures where the mother isn't always the one who's feeding the child, and where not only the mother needs the information, but other relevant caregivers need that information. And we also need to more fully understand the constraints that are faced by caregivers and consider the roles of supplemental food programs and subsidies. And then just before ending, I'd like to just take a minute to comment that having a position relatively late in the program affords the opportunity to really reflect on some of the prior presentations. And what we've heard is that in many middle-income country settings, such as Mexico, there have been very, very rapid changes in the last several decades. And these economic changes have dramatically altered the landscape of diet and feeding patterns for children. And if we look at today's childbearing women, they were born when low birth weight and maternal undernutrition were much more highly prevalent. And they've grown up with this mismatch that you heard about from Dr. Desai. And though today's mothers are more likely to be overweight and obese, and in turn, their offspring are more likely to suffer from the consequences of maternal excesses. And you heard about those mechanisms during pregnancy that increase the risk of obesity in the offspring. So when we reflect on that and put that together with what we know about today's obesogenic diet, I think it's important for us to consider the altered physiology and to think that today's infants are more susceptible and they need even more of our attention in optimizing their complementary feeding to prevent the obesity problems that we're seeing in so many places today. So thank you for your attention.
Muchísimas gracias. Gracias. De esta manera queremos agradecer a la doctora Linda Ariel por su intervención y pues recibe usted la constancia de manos del doctor Samuel Flores, jefe del Departamento de Investigación en Salud Comunitaria del Hospital Infantil Federico Gómez. Muchísimas gracias. Gracias, doctor. También le agradecemos su participación. Y bueno, pues, señoras y señores, a continuación queremos obviamente invitarlos a realizar el corte en este momento, el corte a comer, no sin antes recordarles que retomaremos nuestras actividades en punto de las 2 de la tarde, por lo cual les pedimos, por favor, seamos puntuales. Hay que seguir las indicaciones del personal para trasladarnos hacia el espacio donde se les ofrece en estos momentos el servicio de alimentos. Tengan todos ustedes muy buen provecho. Retomamos nuestras actividades en punto de las 2 de la tarde.